Right, yes, I just read this book, or I just finished this book. It's called The Kindest Use a Knife by Vanessa Jones. And I'll read the back to you, just like the first paragraph. It says, "He was huge, shuddering, his face so reddened with anger it was almost black. He came over to James and pushed a finger and thumb under his jaw. He said, 'You've gone too far this time,' shouted, 'You've gone too far,' jabbing a finger in James's face. 'You're over.' Then he was gone. It happened all so quickly. There was barely anything to recover from. He was gone. 2 days later, he was dead." Right, so this book is about the character. What? There's a character called Lee, who is the one who, in that paragraph, came in and shouted at James, and it's all told from the perspective of Lee's therapist, whose name is Peter. And so it's hypothesized that James killed Lee 2 days after Lee shouted at him in that paragraph. The book is written in quite an interesting way because it's written in lots of little parts. Like you can, I don't know if you can see, but on this page you can see there's 65 different parts on this page. So you get little tiny excerpts of what's going on. Because it starts off, I think it started off in the courtroom where James is on trial basically for having killed Lee. And then it sort of goes back because the therapist is thinking backwards through time, sort of about whether or not he could have prevented the death or anything like that, if he could have said something that would have changed the events or anything. And the events aren't as they seem. They are presented in an odd way to start with. You get little excerpts and you have to sort of piece it together and try and get there. So I thought it was a very good book because it's quite interesting. I think that the way that Lee died was quite scary to me. It was mentioned twice in the book. It was mentioned sort of halfway through. It was mentioned how the court perceived his death to have been, and then at the end you hear how it really was. But no, it wasn't done with a knife, by the way. It was with an injection needle, and it's horrible. Yeah, it was horrible. But it was a good book. It's very interesting. I thought also it was quite interesting how the therapist describes some of the characters, because obviously as a therapist he only really knew one character. He only spoke directly, I suppose, to Lee. He spoke to him twice a week for ages. But other characters he barely knew. He only knew through the accounts of his client. Okay, right. I'll read you how he describes two of the people. He describes Lee as being, so this is how he describes Lee. "He was such a physical being, long, pulled up and proud. His presence, like a technicolor aura, made him more than three-dimensional. Also, almost superimposed, he was wonderful to look at. The flint in his eyes, the crease in his chin, that waist extended like a dancer's, the length of his limbs. And him, inside his body, his warmth, his wanting to know, himself first, others after, his interest, his instinct to touch, tactile as a child. But rage could fill him, drinks could, drugs." So that's how he sees his client. He sees him as, good looking, but he sort of exaggerates it to himself. And then the way he sees Lee's best friend James is completely different. He sees him, he says, "I've no idea what he looks like. I invent him a face, white skin, cruel mouth, weak eyes, for no palpable reason." Yeah, He says he looks after Lee, he feeds him, houses him, but there's something that feels not quite right, not quite healthy. I read in between the lines of the stories Lee tells me. So he has his client, who is Lee, and all the other characters he has to invent to himself. Obviously, he doesn't know them, he's never seen them. So he says right there, he invents him a face. He invents it, he doesn't actually know. And he invents it, I guess, with the biased eyes of someone who's only seen one half of the story. But yeah, it was an interesting book. I would recommend it, apart from the death is quite, it's quite hard to take, I think. So you've got to bear that in mind.